Hi everybody, I'm David Clark and I live in Tucson. I drove up here to talk about exploring new possibilities with PostCSS. I'm on the GitHub and Twitter at David the Clark, and if you want to, so the goal of the talk is to expose you to a lot of things. So there's a lot of slides, there's a lot of information, a lot of links that you may want to follow later. The slides are publicly available. If you want to follow along now, you can go to this URL, slides.com, David Clark, exploring PostCSS, and that'll just give you the slides. If you do the /live at the end, then they'll be changing when I change as well. So whichever way you want to do it, if you want to follow the links that I have. If you haven't seen that snazzy geometry before, that's the PostCSS logo. It's an old alchemical symbol. So here we go. I believe that every front-end developer should learn about PostCSS. It's just that important. It's not something that you should ignore, that you should plan to look into sometime down the line. It's something that can really change your workflow. So after this talk, I'm hoping that everyone in this room will know the basics and be able to share them with others. Some questions that the talk should answer are, what is PostCSS really? Not a lot of what you may read is not necessarily accurate, so I want to try to give as accurate a picture as possible. Why is PostCSS important? And what kinds of tools are people building with PostCSS? Just kind of broad stroke exposure to the type of stuff that is out there. Oops. And then some feelings that this talk should foster. Curiosity to check out the tools that are being built with PostCSS, hopefully excitement about what is possible with it, eagerness maybe to contribute to the ecosystem, and some kind of desperate compulsion to add PostCSS to your workflow. First though, I do want to acknowledge that some people seem to be more annoyed than excited by the existence of PostCSS. And maybe some people in this audience, or maybe not, but I want to address that up front instead of letting it linger in the background and maybe have people leaving and grumbling that their concerns didn't get addressed. So I'll summarize and respond to some of the common complaints that I've heard. Maybe these are straw men, maybe not, I don't know. So I've heard it's probably just an unnecessary toy, sort of the common complaint about new tools that come out. I think that CSS presents problems and PostCSS helps us solve them. That's not unnecessary. That's sort of what we do. That's what development is. So I don't know about that argument. Sass is enough. We hear this a lot. And it's true that Sass is great, but Sass presents one kind of answer to one subset of CSS problems. That's also not enough. There's no reason to stop there. No matter how wonderful Sass is, we can always build more things. We can have variations. And on top of that, we can solve new problems that Sass is not very good at solving. But you're tired of learning. I'm tired of learning. We all get tired sometimes. But I would say that no matter, I have another thing. PostCSS is important enough to be worth it, to be worth the effort. It can change the way you work with CSS. It's probably not going to go away for a while, and certainly the approach that it has is not going to go away, even if another tool is built that does the same thing. Essentially, instead of complaining about CSS or hoping that a preprocessor solves the problem already, that some geniuses that you don't know are building, you can enable the style sheets that you want, piece together the features that you want, and it's very easy to build the features that don't exist. And instead of relying 100% on discipline to write decent CSS, which is what the subject of a lot of CSS literature and talks is, you can work on tools to mechanically enforce those best practices. You can find or create things to keep your CSS in order. So back to the first question, what is PostCSS? Maybe you know, or you don't know, or maybe you think you know, but you're not quite right. Either way, I'm going to go through some of the basics here. PostCSS is a tool for making CSS tools with JavaScript. That's a pretty generic definition because it's actually a pretty generic low-level tool. You make other tools with it. So it just gives you the power that you didn't have before. I don't know, these analogies are okay. The best I could think of, it's kind of like a hammer maybe, or a steam engine, or anything along those lines. That is, without a hammer, you probably wouldn't bother trying to build furniture where you have to somehow get this nail through two pieces of wood. So you'd give up early. Without a steam engine, there's certainly no way that you would try to build a train. You would stick to the transportation mechanisms that you had before. So PostCSS is a tool, a low-level tool like these that other things are built on top of. And also like that, unless you're writing a module, creating a tool yourself, you're not using PostCSS directly. You're using plugins, just like when you're writing an old train. Well, trains, maybe they weren't even built with steam engines. Maybe I'm making that up. Steamboats. There, that's certainly solid. All right, so if you're writing a steamboat, you're not interacting with the steam engine. You're interacting with a boat that is built that relies upon it. So maybe you're thinking, why do I need PostCSS to build a CSS tool? Why not just go at it with whatever else I have? Well, let's say that you want to build a CSS tool. You'll probably need to do a few things to accomplish your task. You'll need to parse CSS. The more accurately and quickly you do that, the better. You'll have to transform style sheets in one way or another. You'll need to create source maps, really, which is going to make you cry. And you're going to have to handle pre-existing source maps. That is because your tool might be in a chain of other tools, and then output some source map that other tools might modify. And you're going to have to register errors and warnings with source positions, or else they're not going to be very helpful to your user. And in the end, you're going to have to give up and do something else. But PostCSS handles these problems for you so that you can focus on your specific task. A little hypothetical example to illustrate more of how that works. Let's pretend that CSS adds a size property. It's not yet supported by browsers, but it's defined, and it's going to be supported at some point. The little code example shows you what it does. You have size, 2 pixel values, and they get translated into width and height. You want to write a tool so that you can use this now. All right, so you think, maybe I just use a regular expression to find size, and I do some regular expression find and replace. It's pretty simple transformation. It shouldn't be much of a problem. But what about size? The word size appearing in other properties. You got background size, font size, maybe something else that I haven't thought of. And so that's going to complicate your regular expression. Then size might also appear in values, keyframe animation names. Could be anything, so you might have an animation with the word size inside of it. Maybe you've got a function that has the word size inside of it. So maybe you add to your regular expression that it has to have a colon after it. But what if there's the size property with white space before the colon? That's going to make things a little bit more complicated, and that is valid CSS. You might have the word size in your selectors, maybe even with a colon after them, like the class heading full size, colon first child. It's going to be very difficult to distinguish that size from the size in your actual property. And then you might have this very thing, size 20 pixels, 10 pixels in a comment. How are you going to tell that you're not inside of a comment? And then you're going to have to generate a source map. You're going to have to modify an existing source map. You're going to have to do the whole informing users of syntax errors. And that's all going to make you kind of crazy. And all of it was just to implement this little silly size property. So obviously, that's not worth it. What you thought was a simple task ballooned into something unmanageable, ridiculous proportions. And if you managed to pull it off, you had a really solid tool, you had great tests for it, you knew that it worked, it's probably way more complex than the outcome justifies. And maintaining it is going to be more of a headache than it's worth. So the solution is use PostCSS as the groundwork, and all the problems that we just talked about are solved for you, the ones that made that other slide so cluttered. This tool already exists. The size property is not real, that's not implemented, but somebody created, actually the creator of PostCSS created PostCSS size. And this is essentially all of the code that PostCSS size needs to do what it does and address all of those problems. Very straightforward. You tap into the parsed CSS node, you walk through all the declaration nodes, check is this declaration's property size, not font size or background size, but size exactly, and PostCSS handles the white space ambiguities. And then you, let's see, that sizes variable uses a little PostCSS list utility to parse out the sizes. You get your width, you get your height. You create new nodes, a width and a height node. You're cloning the existing declaration in order to carry over source map data. And then you remove the original size node. If you needed to somewhere, you could use PostCSS's error and warning APIs, and those would include source, line, and column positions. So it's all covered. That bit of code is going to be incredibly easy to write tests for, incredibly easy to maintain. You as a user might not know very much about JavaScript, but there's a very good chance you could still go in and debug this, find the solution, submit a PR, whereas God knows what you would find if you tried to dig into the Sass code base, for example. That code is not actually the PostCSS size code. I changed it for legibility. The PostCSS size code is even shorter. So how does that work? Here's a rough overview of what's going on. There are 4 things involved in the process. You have your source style sheet, your tree of nodes, the plugins, and then the output CSS that gets eaten by the browser, or fed to the browser. First step is to parse. We have some CSS here, and you're parsing that source string into a set of nodes. There's the root node, there's a rule, declaration, an at rule, which has another rule inside it, which has a declaration inside that. If any of these words, by the way, are unfamiliar, like you don't know exactly what declaration means, it's a really good idea to learn that terminology, and this link is a great app that can help you learn that. I didn't know it all very solidly until I started working with PostCSS quite a bit. So once you have the nodes parsed, those nodes have properties that store the information about them. An at rule might have a name and params. A rule has a selector, declarations have props and values, and you can use those to do what you need to do. So that's the parse step. Now when you have that node tree, it provides a very friendly API that can make it easy to traverse and analyze and transform the CSS constructs of the source code. So this is just a few of the API methods here. Walk rules, go through all the rules in the root. If you're in a rule, walk through all the declarations in that rule. If you're in a declaration, maybe you want to insert a new node before, you want to clone a node, you want to remove a node. It's a very easy, straightforward API to deal with. That's your transform step. And then the last step is your tree of nodes, which may have gone through any number of plugins, may or may not have been transformed in any number of ways, is stringified to create the CSS that you can feed the browser. And that resultant CSS has its source map created and its original formatting completely preserved. If you like to have your CSS styled in a special way, I mean like the white space and the tabs and that kind of stuff, PostCSS is very careful about preserving all of that the way that you like it. You're going to minify it anyway, so it doesn't matter. Let's see. Right, so that's what PostCSS is. And now I want to clear up a couple of misconceptions that I've seen about the project and the ecosystem to clarify what PostCSS is not. Maybe some of this is sort of self-explanatory after getting a good understanding of what PostCSS is, but it's worth pointing out. It's not another either-or situation, which we are so good at creating that can make us very exasperated, tear our minds apart. Things like, do I choose Sass or Less, Browserify or Webpack, Gulp or Grunt, Angular or Ember or React? These kinds of things can make us crazy. And it's no fault of the tools themselves. It's not like Sass should have made it so that you could also use Less, or these other things should have been more interoperable. It's just part of the nature of the business. But it means that we're always second guessing ourselves, always worrying, did we pick the wrong one? Always wondering if the person with the new thing is doing the right thing and we're screwing up, and it can make you crazy. And you may have thought that PostCSS was another one of those, like, do I have to pick now whether I'm leaving Sass and adopting PostCSS? No, not really. PostCSS offers the rare yes and, which is great. It can be added on top of existing stuff, used alongside existing stuff, used in all kinds of different ways. And there are really no restrictions to what you can do with that parsed node tree that PostCSS gives to your plugin. So I've heard this before, or something like this. PostCSS is an alternative to Sass and Less, but faster and with future-friendly syntax. This, especially at the beginning of PostCSS's rise in popularity, this was probably the most common understanding of what PostCSS is, and it's pretty wrong. It's both technically wrong and unnecessarily limited. All the important words in this sentence raise some questions. It's not itself an alternative. Yes, PostCSS can power new and maybe better processor alternatives. And you can also use it alongside other processors. So that's not a standard alternative. As for speed, PostCSS is definitely at the front of the race. It's more than fast enough. I think there's a little controversy lately as to whether libsass is faster than PostCSS or not. They're both blazingly fast and as fast as you need. They both kick RubySass to the ground, and you can, that's pretty much the distinction between preprocessor or processor speeds, I think, is RubySass and everything else. And then the future-friendly syntax part is true. Yes, PostCSS can power plugins that enable future CSS syntax. And it can power plugins that enable all kinds of other syntaxes that are never going to be adopted by the browsers. So that's unnecessarily limited. It's inaccurate and narrow. Another early definition of PostCSS, or early way of explaining what it was in contrast to the existing tools, was that it's a post processor as opposed to the preprocessors. So once again, these words raise problems. One problem is that a lot of people have used these words without really having a strict definition for them. So the distinction becomes kind of meaningless. But some people do have a strict definition, so we can address that. Let's say that a post processor takes standard CSS, real CSS that current or future browsers could read, and processes it and outputs more real CSS, usually CSS with fallbacks. An auto prefixer is the prototypical example of this. You put in your CSS without any vendor prefixes, it outputs the vendor prefixed CSS that all the browsers can understand. A preprocessor, on the other hand, takes non-standard CSS, style sheets that a browser cannot read, and outputs standard CSS, and that's Sass and Less and Stylus and whatever. So I believe that PostCSS was originally created to power auto prefixer, and that was because Sass and Less preprocessors weren't sufficient to get that job done. But so that means that you can definitely build post processors by this definition with PostCSS, but you can also build preprocessors with PostCSS. People are building both. They're building tons and tons of plugins of both types, so that distinction sort of falls away. So back to the accurate definition. PostCSS is a tool for making CSS tools with JavaScript. That's technically accurate. The way that we use the word PostCSS, we're also referring to the ecosystem of PostCSS powered plugins. And that's the same with other plugin systems like Gulp and Grunt. When we talk about Gulp, we're usually not talking about the actual Gulp software, the functions and stuff that it exposes, but we're talking about the whole ecosystem. So I was lucky enough to find this old alchemical illustration that I am going to propose is the illustration of the PostCSS ecosystem. Everyone's happy, the sun, the moon, the men, the women. So talking about the PostCSS ecosystem, I'm going to bring up this question: how do we pick tools, and then some of the different tool types that are available there. So, when I'm doing this, I'm going to contrast the PostCSS ecosystem way of doing things with the older pre-post CSS way of doing things. First question that we ask when we're dealing with tools is, how do we pick them? The old way was typically to choose a preprocessor. We pick Last or Sass or Stylus, and we use what it and its few libraries offer, and we stop there. With PostCSS, we get the yes and, as I said before. We get to pick and choose the features that we want. We don't have to include any features that we don't want. So if you're a Sass user, you may have read the horror stories about misuses of extend or for loops. If you are afraid of extends and for loops and you don't want to poison your code base with them, just don't include them. It's fine, and nobody's going to be able to use them if you haven't included that plugin. If you don't want to pick and choose all your pieces manually, you can use a plugin pack. CSS Next, pre-CSS, oldie. There's a number of plugin packs. There should be more plugin packs, though. That's a place where the ecosystem could grow. You can do both, use a plugin pack and then add things on top of it, or, and this is the best part, you can build your own solution if nothing seems exactly right for what you want to do. So one type of tool that we are used to that we really need are fallback generators. The old way was we take a preprocessor specific library. I've got a Sass example prefixing the transforms, rem picks in order to create a margin declaration that has rems with pixel fallbacks, and then you've got the flex grow, which is a less it's provided by less hat. It's a less parametric mix-in. You can't use these both in the same style sheet because it's two different preprocessors. And you're not using the actual properties. You're using these special syntax features. With PostCSS, the convention is that you create these tools where you allow the user to just write standard CSS and then output the fallbacks. So you just write transform, translate, and it's covered. You write your CSS with rems, and your pixel fallbacks get created. You write flex grow, you use the actual standard syntax, and everything is covered for you. This PostCSS approach is fundamentally, I think, more powerful than mix-in libraries for this purpose. This is why auto prefixer was created, which is why PostCSS was created, which was a very, very good reason. There's a long, long list of fallback generators with PostCSS. I just pointed out the ones that I was using in those examples: auto prefixer, pixrem, color RGBA fallback. Wait, examples? Yeah, they're not all used in the examples, but that's kind of self-explanatory. Pseudo elements takes your double colon before and after, which is the actual standard, and puts it into single colon syntax that IE8 can understand. Opacity and filter gradient also create IE8 fallbacks. Oldie and CSS Grace are packs. Uh-oh, did I lose track? Okay, Oldie and CSS Grace are packs that do the same thing. And I was inspired by Mr. Snook's talk today to throw in a note about PostCSS initial, because he brought up all initial, and there is already a PostCSS plugin to enable this syntax. I think that it's pretty good. It's probably not exactly what you're going to get with the eventual all initial declaration, but it does the job. So you can scope your styles locally, do the local resets that you need. Another thing that Mr. Snook mentioned was container queries. There is a container query polyfill. I don't know what polyfill means, but that's what he's calling it. And that is created with PostCSS and has some JavaScript to go with it to enable this draft syntax of container queries. So I think that that approach is hugely superior, and my pronouncement is that all CSS fallback generating tools should be written as PostCSS plugins that simply compile standard CSS. You should not be writing mix-in libraries for this stuff. And that means that what was once the most convincing reason to use Sass or Less, along with their libraries Compass, Bourbon, Less Hat, is now an almost incontrovertible reason to get PostCSS into your workflow, even if it's not the only thing in your workflow. Remember that some people have and still do reject preprocessors, worrying that even something like something as widely accepted as Sass and Less add more complication than they solve. I've always found that this fallback argument was the most convincing to me that it's worth it to get that into my workflow. And now that argument is really pointing directly at PostCSS. So another type of tool that we create for our CSS is just general utilities. The old way was to use preprocessor specific libraries that use preprocessor specific constructs. So we've got a parametric mixin from Less that is for absolute positioning. Transition timing function ease insert, that's a Sass parameter. And then a Sass from the Suzy grid library mixin to create a column that spans one of 4. The new way, I lost my new way part. The new way is to use standard CSS constructs to do the same thing. So instead of a parametric mixin that only Less will understand, we could create an absolute property that takes coordinates. Instead of a variable that only Sass is going to understand, we can just create a new keyword, ease insert. And we can create a new property rather than that span mixin, lost column. Lost is a grid system written in CSS. And so the other processors are not going to trip up on that, because they're not trying to figure out exactly what lost column is doing. They're just like, that's another property, just throw it out with, or throw it along the tube just like the rest of the CSS. Now maybe some of this bothers you. Are you upset by non-standard properties and keywords? Some people are. It's a legitimate concern. What are we worried about? It's confusing. Maybe it's confusing. How are people going to know that that absolute property is not a real CSS property? And they're going to look it up on the internet, and they're going to spend hours trying to figure out what's going on here, and it's all going to be for naught. Mixins, on the other hand, are explicit. You've got include, absolute. So they're going to know what's going on. Mixin libraries are therefore better. This is often brought up when people are having some kind of fight, PostCSS versus Sass, and these people are on the Sass side, and they really like the explicitness of the mixins. So is that a valid criticism of PostCSS? I don't know. If you don't know your tool set, you don't know that absolute is not really a property, and you don't know what tools are altering the possibilities of your style sheets, there's probably nothing that will save you. And if you can't find out that absolute is not a real property within minutes, then you should find some better resources. Also, you can keep in mind that one plugin is not the PostCSS ecosystem. So if that absolute plugin looks like garbage to you, why would I create a new property just to do that? Then just don't use it, and it's fine. And that's no reason not to use PostCSS or discourage others from using it. Finally, the fact that PostCSS can be used to make things I don't like is not really a problem. That's the same with everything in the world. And is it a solvable problem? That's another question that's maybe more important. I lost my ordering here, but there are ways to solve this problem. Namespaces, that lost column example, every property that lost the library creates is prefixed with lost. So you can tell it apart. Another possibility would be add some punctuation in there. Make it look like a vendor prefix if you wanted to, if you thought that that was a good idea. And then there are also mechanical solutions. There's something called PostCSS plugin context, and that's the first code example there. So that says that everything inside this block is going to have CSS Next available to it. So if I look at the gray function and I realize like that's not standard, I know why, because I'm in this context with CSS Next. Or there's PostCSS use, where at the top of your style sheet you declare what PostCSS plugins you're using within that style sheet specifically. So I know that I can just throw in display flex without prefixes and it's going to work. So I think it's really interesting that that criticism came up for PostCSS, and almost instantaneously these solutions popped up. There's sort of a discipline-based solution to use namespace, and there are mechanical solutions as well. Back to utilities. Another thing that happened in the old way was that we treat extended CSS like a barely adequate programming language. And this is a snippet from a Sass library that I don't even want to understand. So we'll move beyond it, because I would rather just use JavaScript. PostCSS tools are node scripts, meaning that you write JavaScript. It's the capable programming language that you already know. You don't have to relearn, how do I make a map-like thing? How do I like iterate through a list? How do I reduce an array? It's all there. And you have all the standard library of Node and all of the huge ecosystem of NPM at your disposal right away. So you're going to skip a lot of weird, sassy hacks. Also, you don't need to wait for new features in your preprocessor to get basic data structures. People were excited about Sass maps, which is great, but like maps, objects, they already existed in every other language, so it's kind of weird that we had to wait for that. Because of all this, because PostCSS tools can play nice with other processors, and you have JavaScript to work with, the creator of the Lost Grid system, who's made a bunch of interesting tools, Corey Simmons, says all my libraries will be written in PostCSS from now on, and you should do the same. He gave this presentation pretty recently. And I agree with him. I think we should be using standard CSS language constructs like properties, keywords, @rules, and functions in PostCSS-powered utilities that will work within any node-capable build process. And we shouldn't hesitate from taking advantage of Node and the whole NPM ecosystem to make those things work. Another type of tool that we love is non-standard syntax. The old way was that you choose a preprocessor and you do what it allows. So we've got for loops, interpolated variables, extends, mix-ins, and that's Sass on the top. Similar things happening in Less at the bottom. Neither tool is going to understand the others. With PostCSS, you pick and choose your language extensions. You will never be in the situation that you may have found yourself in before where like you're a Sass user and you wish you could use that Less thing, or the other way around. You're a Less user and wish you could use a for loop. You just pick and choose the pieces. You pick it based on your preferences, your project, and your team. So it can be very specialized. Many of the plugins and packs available in PostCSS are based on W3C spec drafts. Here we've got an example of custom properties, the nesting, custom media queries, custom selectors, the color function, and that's just a few of the things that are possible. But there's a warning that this is not like ES 2015. If you're familiar with Babel, it's not ratified, stable stuff and it might not be implemented. These things are at varying stages of the standards process. So it's not exactly the same as using Babel and knowing that these are ingrained language features. But at some point, some of them will be. And so then it would be safe to use them just as much as with Babel. But let's say that you've got problems with the future CSS idea, and so you don't want to even bother with that. That's okay. You use other plugins that offer Sass or Less or stylus or even Rust-like syntax. Here we've got a mix-in that's very Sass-like variable. That height at width is a stylus feature, I believe. You can reference other properties. We've got a for loop that is very Sass-like at the bottom. And that's all enabled by PostCSS plugins. Then there's this thing. This is a PostCSS match plugin, uses this Rust match syntax where it's kind of like a switch case statement if you're familiar with JavaScript. If animal is a variable, if it's snake, you give color green. If it's buffalo or bear, you give background brown. If it's a lion, font weight bold, and then the default is just output color gray. So that's just the list of some of those that we saw. And I point out here that there's PostCSS mix-ins and there's PostCSS sassy mix-ins. So this is another feature of the PostCSS ecosystem, that if there's a plugin that you kind of like PostCSS mix-ins, but you wish that it were slightly different, just tweak the syntax a little, you can do that. And it's not a big deal because neither of your plugins are very much code to maintain. But let's say you love your preprocessor's syntax. That's fine, just use it. One way of using it is to take your styles, run it through your preprocessor, then run it through PostCSS, and then you have your output CSS at the end. There are also some tools popping up like PostSCSS and PostStylus that bunch those two steps together. So it runs it through SCSS and PostCSS and then outputs all in one build step. Or you can take your source, run it through PostCSS with a special parser, then run it through your preprocessor, and then run it through CSS. PostCSS SCSS is a plugin that the author of PostCSS wrote to enable PostCSS to understand SCSS syntax, not trip up on it. It doesn't compile Sass, but it means that like if you do an inline comment, 2 slashes, it's not going to throw a syntax error. It's going to understand that that's okay. And anybody who wants to write less in stylus parsers, the technology is there, and then you can do the same thing with your language of choice. You can also just reproduce the syntax that you like with a plugin. This pack pre-CSS is a lot of Sass features recreated with PostCSS plugins. And the reason that the author made that, the advantage that the author felt it had, was then he had these modular plugins. They were each smaller and more easily testable and more easily debuggable, such that he could actually, one guy could maintain it in addition to a bunch of other projects, instead of having like a foundation that has a bunch of maintainers with a hugely complicated code base. You can also divide up your tasks based on what they are. You could use the preprocessor for transforms and then have a completely separate pipeline where you run your CSS through PostCSS just for analysis, where you're not actually outputting new CSS, but you're just linting and you're getting statistics or whatever it is along those lines that you want to use. And that brings up this other type of tool, the analytical tools. And this is something that that makes PostCSS really stand out from Sass and Less. That it facilitates the building of analytical tools in a way that these other preprocessors have not done. One example, do I use? Do I use goes through your CSS and tells you what browsers your CSS supports, like as opposed to the ones that it has properties it doesn't support, i.e. 7, it'll tell you that. CSS color guard warns you when colors you've added are too similar to ones that already exist. I was just dealing with a style sheet a couple of days ago where there were like 7 variations on light blue, and they were obviously intended to be the same, but somebody had used a different program to like drop and try to estimate the hex value, and they were just slightly off. That's what this protects against. PostCSS colorblind, you can use this to add an automated step to your build process that shows you how your colors would look to someone with color blindness. Toggle a bunch of different color blindness, look at it in the browser, and realize, oh, I need to add more contrast to this in order to make it legible. CSS stats gives you a whole lot of stats, as you could guess. Brian Holt is a Netflix employee who wrote PostCSS colorblind. I just thought this was a good quote from his README, that he was justifying why he built this plugin, and one of the main justifications was that building plugins for PostCSS is damn easy and fun. So I think that analytical tools are really important. They help us mechanically improve the quality of our CSS instead of relying on good intentions and discipline, which is what we've had to rely on for far too long. So some of the PostCSS tools that I've been working a lot on are analysis focused. One of them is PostCSS BEM linter. You can use it to enforce BEM style selector conventions. So you define card, say this is a style sheet for card, and this is a suit CSS syntax. So card is fine, card is disabled is fine, card title small, card body. List item does not belong in this style sheet. It has nothing to do with my card, so it's going to throw an error. Card with these nested or descendants, UL, LI, that's not okay according to the syntax that I've defined, so that's going to throw an error. Card big closed, the hyphenation is a little bit off from my convention, so that's going to throw an error. This way I don't have to rely on discipline. I can keep my style sheets very, very organized and have the machine tell me when something has gone wrong.
That's amazing.
Oh, thank you very much.
It puts the comment next to it in the style, or does it print them out to it?
No, it uses PostCSS's warning API to log these with position numbers, line and column numbers, and then it outputs to the console, well, based on what reporter you're using. So I've got a console reporter that will give you a nice little readout of like, here are all your problems, and if you set it right, then it'll throw an error during your build process if that has been violated. And so that's suit syntax. It also supports BEM syntax with the underscores. So that one's pretty important. This one is also, it's actually much, much bigger. StyleLint enforces at least 100 rules, I think, by now, to keep your CSS clean, legible, consistent, and intentional. So there's an example of StyleLint's output. You've got your color hex case wrong. There's a rule properties order support. So color was supposed to come before width. Declaration colon space after. You forgot your space after your colon. Unexpected shorthand margin after margin top. So that one's trying to warn you of a possible mistake in your CSS. And the goal here is that you don't have to nitpick, you can just auto enforce. I've been looking a lot at some legacy CSS lately, and one of the hardest things about looking at it is all the variations. Some people just write in a single line with no spaces between anything. Some people are really spacing it out, and they have like all kinds of wild indentation because they obviously didn't care about anything. They were just nihilists somehow let loose in the code base. So I can run a single task and catch all of that stuff. And this is a pretty unique tool. Also, it was inspired by SCSS lint. When I was using Sass, I really liked SCSS lint, and I tried to work on that. And it was one of the main reasons I was hesitant to actually leave Sass behind, because I loved that tool, but it required Ruby, which was a pain. There was also CSS lint a while ago, which targeted code smells as opposed to just like formatting conventions. So in my opinion, it didn't do enough. It was not also 100% enforceable. A lot of warnings like, I don't know, you're using a lot of floats in this style sheet. Are you sure you want to do that? Which is useful, totally useful, but I also wanted a tool where I could say the build fails because you didn't do this. Which in some sense is kind of annoying. Like, the build fails because I didn't put a space after my colon, come on. But on the other hand, if you don't automatically enforce that stuff, it's either going to get out of hand, or you're going to have to nitpick each other's style sheets. And a human is going to have to come over and tell you, you should put a space there, and you're going to hate them. But you're not going to hate the machine. Mr. Davis, Larry Davis, this morning spoke about his work at Adobe, and I thought I'd throw in this slide about some things that he brought up that apply well to PostCSS. So he has suit naming conventions. He could use PostCSS BIM linter in order to automatically enforce those. He talked about CSS property ordering conventions. He could use StyleLint for that. He had this whole thing in place, which was pretty cool in his stylus, allowing him to write in pixels, but then output rem values so that he could easily just like change the HTML font size, and everything changes accordingly. And it resulted in this syntax. So he'd say, instead of 38 pixels, 38 asterisk money pixels, which is fine, but you could also write a PostCSS plugin to do that for you, so that you can just write in pixels and choose to output rem or output pixels, depending on your build process. I put in this little guy because I was particularly excited about that, because I thought of it while I was seeing the talk, and I wrote it down, like, oh, I got to put in a new slide about that. And then I told him about it, and he said, oh, yeah, I should really make that interesting. And then I found out that it already exists. And that's often the case with PostCSS plugins. But it's still a very new ecosystem, so there's lots of room for people to come in and build something new. Just for the sake of exposure, a couple of other sort of uncategorized important tools powered by PostCSS. CSS Nano is a minifier, like Uglify for JavaScript, Minify CSS, and Clean CSS that already exist. Perfectionist is, it prettifies style sheets, so it normalizes your white space. It like changes all your tabs to 2 spaces, that kind of thing. It's like another approach to what StyleLint does. Midas is interesting. It's a CSS syntax highlighter. What's interesting about it is it takes PostCSS's pipeline, you stream your CSS into the node tree, but then instead of outputting new CSS, you output HTML that has these classes that you can then use to present your CSS the way that you want it to. PostCSS JS. If you're into JavaScript inline styling, PostCSS JS is there so that you can run CSS through and get JavaScript objects, or run JavaScript objects through and produce real CSS. And that way you can also hook things in, like hook in auto prefixer, so that you don't have to worry about hand coding vendor prefixes in your JavaScript, because that problem has been solved in real CSS. Then there's CSS modules, which is a completely new approach to selectors that makes them local by default instead of the notorious global scope of CSS. It's super interesting. It's a topic that's way too big to bring up here. I just thought I'd add it to the list. And it's only one of a host of scope limiting modules that people are building. The creator of PostCSS gave a talk just a day or two ago at .css in Paris, and his whole focus was these tools that limit your scope, like all initial and some other reset plugin and CSS modules. So in sum, these are my thoughts. That the old approach to CSS problems involved complaining, which is totally legitimate, striving eternally for discipline, which is fine, but it's bound to fail, ignoring problems when they're too small to bother with, like why would you spend a lot of time building a tool when you can just ignore it. Build an awesome but super complex and relatively isolated tool. Things like Sass and Less and Stylus and CSS Lint and CSS Comb and Prefix Free, which are all great tools, but they're not interacting, they're not helping each other. And when one of them drops off the face of the earth, it's not like it pushed other things along necessarily. And then you pick sides instead of features because you have to. And the PostCSS approach can change those things. You never have to shy from addressing a pain point because it's usually not a big deal to go in with some JavaScript and take care of that. You can experiment with new features and syntax. Throw something in, take something out. It's also not a big deal. It's just one plugin. You can try to build mechanical solutions to problems instead of relying just on discipline, instead of relying on everybody doing things the way you want them to do. You can force them. And you can pick and choose features. You share a low-level parser, the node tree, and the stringifier, that is PostCSS itself, with a bunch of other tools. So you're all working together to keep that as fast and accurate as possible. And you'll get better at writing JavaScript in Node if you're into that. So that's it. That was the presentation that I had. I wonder if anybody has any questions that you'd like to ask.